All right, I'm gonna get in big trouble for saying this, but writer's block isn't real. And it's usually a mixture of you either doing too much and or you not having an actual framework for song composition. And this is something that electronic music producers struggle with a lot because they may be great at sound design and may be good at creating a drop. But in terms of actual song structure, that part of the music production process usually isn't taught by YouTube University, which is where most electronic artists seem to get their information from. So what happens for most artists is they're going to spend a bunch of time producing and they're going to have a bunch of fun doing that because that's what they enjoy. But then when it comes to actually polishing stuff up, like doing the mixing, doing the actual mastering and stuff, they usually tend to struggle a little bit more, with the outcome being they don't actually finish a track because they spend maybe 8 hours producing, another 12 hours doing all this other stuff to try to kind of fix up the track, and then they end up just giving up when they're not having fun anymore and they start a new project. And the solution to this whole cycle of hell, if you will, is to start by not overcrowding your tracks too much. So let's say you made a banger and then you kept adding different elements to the track. Let's say you made a build, a little melody section, you then wanted to have a dubstep drop in there, then you wanted to have a hardstyle drop in there, and then you also wanted to have a whole orchestral interlude. Now, nothing about the actual track itself is going to be coherent, and different parts of the track aren't going to work well together. So artists may spend tons of hours trying to make 8 conflicting ideas play nice with each other, when the real issue is that they've got 2 songs in one project. So that's where in the beginning I said a lot of you guys end up just kind of overcomplicating things and doing too much. Sometimes you need to step stuff back and actually cut stuff out and have a couple of elements that then end up working with each other real well to have actual clarity. So what I would do is I would look at the tracks that you're writing and completely take out the emotion from this. Just think purely logically. I spent maybe 8 to 9 hours on this drop, this section, whatever. Is it fine if I remove it to then replace it with something that's going to work better for that section? So what I do with this is I'll identify the 2 emotional cores that are in the track that are kind of fighting with each other. And then I'll split the project into 2 different parts, and I'll keep both versions. And one version can then turn into what other ideas were going on in your head in terms of a separate track for that. But in the end, you're going to basically take whatever track that you're writing and you're going to split the 2 ideas of the 2 things that aren't working with each other into 2 separate releases. So the first thing that may work for you if you struggle with writer's block and you can't finish music is that you simply just need to remove elements from your track in order to give yourself enough space to then fill in the gaps. The next thing is just simply the way your mind works. So let's say I gave you a math exam and it took you 40 minutes to complete this exam. By the end, if I were to ask you a bunch of basic technical questions, because you're using that part of your head and you're really crunching for 40 minutes, your ability to answer those questions are going to be impaired, you're going to be slower than usual, and this usually leads to just not being as intelligent as you would be compared to if you had a fresh mind. So think about every time you've done something that's been mentally strenuous, and then compare that to whatever track that you're producing and think about, have I been using my head in a mentally strenuous way for the last 45 minutes or last hour or even last 2 hours? And should I just get up and take a break in order for that part of my mind to kind of have a rest and be able to refresh? So at the end of a 40-minute math exam, your brain is fried. Making new decisions feels impossible, even really obvious, simple ones. Again, you're just making yourself less intelligent the more you use your head without a break. So the same thing happens if you're producing and you've been producing for a while. After a 3-hour session, you're gonna have biased ears, you're gonna think certain things sound the same. Your ability to make good decisions is gonna start to go away. And at that point, it's not necessarily that your music is bad, it's just that you've made yourself dumber by doing the exact same thing again and again for the last 2 hours. So for that, you need to just take a step away from your actual music production and come back to it after maybe a 30-minute to an hour break. So what I like to do is I'll work in little focused sprints where maybe I'll work for 20 to 30 minutes, maybe 45 to 90 minutes, depending upon how I'm feeling. And then when I reach different stopping points, I completely stop, I step away, I do something else, have a conversation with a friend, use a different part of your head, and then come back to it once you have fresh ears. And at that point, you should hopefully be able to know where to continue the track from where you've started. So the rule is that you cannot make good decisions in a fatigued state. So stop, rest, and return. The final problem with writer's block, and this I think is what I see the most, is that most artists approach every track like a blank canvas and they don't actually have a system for finishing their tracks efficiently. Without a repeatable process, every session starts from zero, tracks never get finished, and instead they get abandoned. So there's a couple of things that I recommend to do for this. One is to set up some kind of framework for your DAW. So for example, with me, I have a setup for when I'm producing where I've got all of the main drum samples that I used in a folder over here. I've got my playlist already set up with the main synths that I use. I'm always using Supersols and I always need a sub bass. So the different parts of your production that you repeat, try to turn those parts into a modular system where you already have your sub bass loaded up, you already have your tracks routed to the side chain correctly, you already have whatever drum samples you usually use put into your track, so then you can get into the actual track and start producing without having to make all these extra decisions that end up clouding your thinking. The other thing you can do in terms of adding systems to your production process is to think about production as a rocket. So if you're going to build a rocket, if you're going to go to the moon versus going to Mars, you're going to build two different kinds of rockets, right? The one to the moon is probably going to be a little bit smaller. It's not going to hold as much fuel, whereas the one that's going to Mars is going to need more fuel. It's going to need to be larger. It's just going to need to work entirely differently. So when it comes to your production process, you need to think about why you're building what you're building. So instead of just sitting down and blindly throwing down melodies and drum loops and everything else, actually stop and think about, what is the goal? What's the intent of what I'm building? So you don't just build something that ends up not being coherent with whatever theme you have for your brand or theme that you have for what you're trying to detail in a track. And then once you know what you're trying to produce, before you even touch your DAW, think through, do I have the capabilities to produce what I'm imagining in my head? Let's say I want to produce a dubstep track surrounding an earthquake. So the theme is going to be here comes the earthquake, and then the drop's going to hit. If I've never produced a dubstep drop before, it may make sense for me to do something like practice building dubstep drops before I go and I make this project where I'm really trying to do something more complex. If not, then I'm going to reach writer's block once I get to the drop because I've never built a dubstep drop before. So one of the things that you can do is figure out your intention, and then you can practice the different sections that you know are going to go into making the track with that intention that you desire. The next thing is when you do finally go to write the full track, you want to blueprint first. So what I encourage people to do is just outline your basic chords, your melody, MIDI drums, literally get the bare bones down, but have the entire track built from start to finish and kind of know where every single piece is going to occur. No, we're going to have an intro, we're going to have this melody here or tell this story through this vocalist here, and then I'm going to have this kind of build, and then we're going to have a drop, and then then I'm going to just kind of reuse and repeat these different parts of the song, so then you have an entire cohesive track that you just need to add meat to. So the goal here is to blueprint, pretty much build the bare bones, or build a wireframe, if you will, and then we're going to add meat to those bones later through the engineering. And going off of systems, this is where if you can then automate the engineering, if you can already have your mixer tracks set up for things that you use usually, or have your sidechain automatically set up and working, or vocal ducking, or anything else fancy that you usually do, having automated systems for stuff that you're just going to repeat, such as mastering, having templates and presets for that is going to be super powerful. So in conclusion, try to find ways to set things up based upon what you end up repeating in your tracks the most to limit the amount of brain power that you're using, so that can be used towards making the best track possible. And then in terms of the actual construction of the track, make sure you know why you're producing what you're producing and that you've practiced the different sections that are going to go into that track in little, 5 to 10 minute DAW sessions. And then go and actually do the blueprinting, think through the basic structure of this track that you're producing, and then actually produce out the bare bones, and then do all the engineering to put meat on the bones. This is going to be creative work. This is going to be logical work. This is going to be creative work. Make sure you're taking breaks in between, as I explained through here. But besides that, this is pretty much the biggest thing that people struggle with in terms of writer's block. It's they're jumping into a DAW without an intention, without knowing what the heck they even want to produce. And then they produce a drop, but they don't understand the different ways that they could then build into that drop, and then they get stuck in terms of their production. So the goal is to get the bare bones down of the track. So instead of you spending all this time up here in this weird, annoying section where you're making all these little tweaks and causing all these little problems for yourself, you instead can just plan stuff out in advance, do your production, and then try to again, have systems to automate your mixing and your mastering, so then you can actually finish tracks and get into the habit of finishing tracks, which is a skill. And then hopefully you'll be this happy face instead of this sad face up here. In the end, if you have a system for finishing tracks efficiently, you're going to save time producing and you're going to be less frustrated. All right, here's my decision tree. Let's say that you're stuck in a session. You've been producing a track for 12 hours and you randomly hit a point where you're not able to finish the track. Some things are sounding a little bit off. You're not really sure what's missing, and you just think that you're a terrible producer. Step one, try to figure out if the track feels unfocused or bloated. If it does, ask yourself if there are two competing emotional directions, and if the answer to that is yes, split the project into two separate projects, and then finish both of those projects. So you'll then have two different songs. And the way that you're going to finish these projects is by going all the way back to square one to our rocket building thing and making sure you have the right intent, that you've practiced the different parts of this intent, you've done the right blueprinting before you go into all the confusing engineering. Step two, if you realize that your track doesn't feel unfocused or bloated, or it doesn't feel like there's two competing emotional directions, then there's got to be something else going on, which is probably just decision fatigue. So have you been producing for 90 minutes straight? Have you not taken a break? Did you not get enough sleep last night and you think that you're able to make the most creative ideas ever without sitting down to actually think through whether or not you should even be producing that day? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, step away, take a 20 to 30-minute break, and then return with fresh ears. Again, take a break, come back, especially if you're doing these longer sessions. Let's say you have a clear system, but you're still having writer's block. What you need to do at this point is pretty much just try to find all different ways that you can automate and remove extra mental friction from your production process. So try to find ways to have almost like a standard operating procedure that you can follow through for things like mastering, or again, for mixing, try to have like mixer channels already set up just to limit the mental friction, so then you can spend a little bit more time focused in a very clean and neat way in your project on whatever the actual deeper problem is, which at this case, since we've already gone through all these other parts of the process of figuring out why the heck you have writer's block, to be honest, at that point, if you still have writer's block, just keep building, keep throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, and your track should form from there. I like to use the concept of doing like a really long jam session, play through like the drums and the chords or whatever you're doing in terms of the background of your track, and then just spend tons of time adding different elements and seeing what the heck works and fits together at that point. And then again, go back to the standpoint of if the track is feeling unfocused or bloated, splitting things up into two separate tracks. So this is why I never have writer's block and how I break through it every time, because I've got a system to take my mind through every single step of the most common issues with writer's block. And then when things don't work out, I just throw stuff at the wall until it does.